Saint Anthony's War Against Demons. Excerpts from the life of Saint Anthony by Saint Athanasius of Alexandria, Bishop, Father, and Doctor of the Church. Saint Anthony, you must know, was by descent an Egyptian. His parents were of good family and possessed considerable wealth, and, as they were Christians, he also was reared in the same faith. In infancy he was brought up with his parents, knowing naught else but them and his home. But when he was grown and arrived at boyhood, and was advancing in years, he could not endure to learn letters, nor caring to associate with other boys, but all his desire was, as it was written of Jacob, to live a plain man at home. After the death of his father and mother, he was left alone with one little sister. His age was about 18 or 20, and on him the care both of home and sister rested. Now it was not 6 months after the death of his parents, and going according to the custom into the Lord's house, he communed with himself, and reflected as he walked how the apostles left all and followed the Saviour, and how they in the Acts sold their possessions, and brought and laid them at the apostles' feet for distribution to the needy, and what and how great a hope was laid up for them in heaven. Pondering over these things he entered the church, and it happened the gospel was being read, and he heard the Lord saying to the rich man, "If thou wouldest be perfect, go and sell that thou hast, and give to the poor, and come follow me, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven." Anthony, as though God had put him in the mind of the saints, and the passage had been read on his account, went out immediately from the church, and gave the possessions of his forefathers to the villagers. They were 300 acres, productive and very fair, that they should be no more a clog upon himself and his sister. And all the rest that was movable he sold, and having gotten together much money he gave it to the poor, reserving a little, however, for his sister's sake. And again, as he went into the church, hearing the Lord say in the gospel, "Be not anxious for the morrow," he could stay no longer, but went out and gave those things also to the poor. Having committed his sister to known and faithful virgins, and put her into a convent to be brought up, he henceforth devoted himself outside his house to discipline, taking heed to himself and training himself with patience. For there were not yet so many monasteries in Egypt, and no monk at all knew of the distant desert, but all who wished to give heed to themselves practiced the discipline in solitude near their own village. Now there was then in the next village an old man who had lived the life of a hermit from his youth up. Anthony, after he had seen this man, imitated him in piety, and at first he began to abide in places outside the village. Then if he heard of a good man anywhere, like the prudent bee, he went forth and sought him, nor turned back to his own palace until he had seen him, and he returned, having got from the good man as it were supplies for his journey in the way of virtue. So dwelling there at first, he confirmed his purpose not to return to the abode of his fathers, nor to the remembrance of his kinsfolk, but to keep all his desire and energy for perfecting his discipline. He worked, however, with his hands, having heard, "He who is idle, let him not eat," and part he spent on bread, and part he gave to the needy. And he was constant in prayer, knowing that a man ought to pray in secret unceasingly. For he had given such heed to what was read that none of the things that were written fell from him to the ground, but he remembered all, and afterwards his memory served him for books. Thus conducting himself, Anthony was beloved by all. He subjected himself in sincerity to the good men whom he visited, and learned thoroughly where each surpassed him in zeal and discipline. But the devil, who hates and envies what is good, could not endure to see such a resolution in a youth, but endeavored to carry out against him what he had wont to effect against others. First of all he tried to lead him away from the discipline, whispering to him the remembrance of his wealth, care for his sister, claims of kindred, love of money, love of glory, the various pleasures of the table, and the other relaxations of life. And at last, the difficulty of virtue and the labor of it. He suggested also the infirmity of the body and the length of the time. In a word, he raised in his mind a great dust of debate, wishing to debar him from his settled purpose. But when the enemy saw himself to be too weak for Anthony's determination, and that he rather was conquered by the other's firmness, overthrown by his great faith, and falling through his constant prayers, then at length, putting his trust in the weapons which are in the navel of his belly, and boasting in them, for they are his first snare for the young, he attacked the young man, disturbing him by night and harassing him by day, so that even the onlookers saw the struggle which was going on between them. The one would suggest foul thoughts, and the other counter them with prayers. The one fire him with lust, the other, as one who seemed to blush, fortify his body with faith, prayers, and fasting. And the devil, unhappy wit, one night even took upon him the shape of a woman, and imitated all her acts simply to beguile Anthony. But he, his mind filled with Christ and the nobility inspired by him, and considered the spirituality of the soul, quenched the coal of the other's deceit. Again the enemy suggested the ease of pleasure, but he, like a man filled with rage and grief, turned his thoughts to the threatened fire and the gnawing worm, and setting these in array against his adversary, passed through the temptations unscathed. All this was a source of shame to his foe, for he, deeming himself like God, was now mocked by a young man, and he who boasted himself against flesh and blood was being put to flight by a man in the flesh. For the Lord was working with Anthony. The Lord, for our sake, took flesh, and gave the body victory over the devil, so that all who truly fight can say, "Not I, but the grace of God which was with me."